Judge Shaw.
Shaw.
Yeah.
Okay. And do I need to put any like specific district?
The 436 District Court.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about what you've seen in this courtroom. We talked about it a little bit when I first got here, but children who face challenges that may not necessarily need to be sitting in a courtroom because of their struggles.
You know, so we handle all criminal cases, kids between the age of 10 to 17, sometimes a little bit older, depending on the charge. We do get a lot of cases on the assault side, or just a fight at school or at home, maybe escalates, and during the fight they hit a teacher and they arrest a child, and when you hit a teacher, it's an automatic felony. So we get a lot of those. Probation does a really good job of screening those when they bring them to detention, whether or not they should be detained. Sometimes few may fall through the cracks, and they are detained. And we have some really serious kids back there who can hurt themselves or hurt others. So now we're mixing those two together, and sometimes that can be kind of unfortunate.
So what is your job when they come and they stand in front of you in your courtroom?
So we don't have a bond system on the juvenile side. It's always detention hearings. So we have to do a detention hearing at least every 10 days. I can shorten the time, but at least every 10 days. And at that time, I decide whether or not I'm going to release this child back home or to CPS custody or wherever else, or keep this child detained. And so we keep doing that until their case is resolved.
So the reason we're here, there's a case out of Northside ISD. A student who lives with autism ends up hitting, hurting an aide, and they've been arrested, charged with aggravated assault. In those cases where that child has some sort of disability or challenge that they're facing, what do you think is the most appropriate step rather than throwing cuffs on them and sending them to you?
Without getting into specific cases, I think a lot of the community tends to go towards PD, sheriff's departments, as their first resource. There's other resources in our communities through churches, nonprofits, that can really help these families and help these kids. But it seems so immediate, it seems so dangerous at that time that PD is typically called initially and the arrest is made. And then we get kids that come in here that next day and they're frightened. They know their actions weren't the best, but sometimes there's mental health challenges, different diagnoses that the court's not aware about because they were just arrested. It takes time for probation to kind of dig into the facts of that case and to that child to understand the best needs for that kid.
And when you, or they're brought in front of you and you kind of realize that they're probably not in the best situation for what they're going through, how does that kind of affect your decision?
Well, it really affects it, because what I try to do is develop the best plan possible for not allowing this child to come back to detention. So working with probation, working with the family, working with the DA's office, how can we make sure this kid's gonna be successful, be safe, and keep others around them safe? If I have to keep him here a couple of days, I will, but I won't hold him the whole 10 days, depending on the situation. Let's see if we can put together a plan to keep everyone safe and keep this kid on the right track.
And have you ever had direct conversations with where some of these kids come from, like whether that be this school or they had an issue at home?
Yeah, it's a pretty open courtroom. So, probation gets a lot of information that they give to me. Oftentimes, the parents will open up to me, but most importantly is to get these kids to open up. And so once they open up and I see their perspective, where they're coming from, sometimes I have to redirect, or other times I'm listening and say, okay, I understand your point of view, but you're still the child in the situation, and how do we eliminate that negative behavior?
And we talked a little bit before we started rolling about the impact that even just spending those 10 days here can have.
Right.
What does that look like when you try and turn that around and fix what time they've spent here and trying to rehabilitate?
And I'm glad you said rehabilitate, because that's our focus here, is to rehabilitate before they can get into the adult system. Sometimes it scares the living hell out of them. They hate being here. So hopefully, that before they do anything else that is potentially criminal, they think about their process here, they think about their time here, and I don't want to go back. Let me use the tools that I've learned while being in detention. They have, counseling in detention, how to think through conflict, how to think through when you're upset, what can you do to let off that steam. And so hopefully they use those tools when they're out in the community.
And so when we run this story. Obviously, there's a difference between children who make mistakes and children who make choices.
Right.
And a lot of people might lump this child in with someone who made a choice. But as someone who gets to see them firsthand in your courtroom, what do you want the public to know about these kinds of cases?
That there's more to it. The facts are so much thicker. It's so much more in depth than what we see on the news or read in the paper or just hear on social media. There's a lot of history behind these cases. And so instead of making an assumption of whatever that assumption is, really try to understand these are kids dealing with adult issues, and we expect them to act like adults, but they're still kids, and they're still learning to deal with those issues. And their parents are still learning to deal with those issues too, because there's no playbook on being a parent. There's no playbook on being a parent with a child who's autistic or who has some kind of ADHD or whatever. Everyone's trying to learn at the same time.
And in those cases, jumping off of that, when they do have autism, ADHD, and they make these mistakes, how do you kind of manipulate that in a way to let them understand that this is something that you deal with, but it's not who you are, and it doesn't necessarily make these choices okay?
Exactly what you said. This is not who you are. And probation is a great job. Anytime I get the opportunity, I like to advocate for juvenile probation because they provide so many services that's not punitive. It's trying to help you and that family and take advantage of it. And it's one thing I always mention is that it's a shame that some of these kids need to be arrested before getting these services. It would be awesome if they got it before they arrested. But that's the system that we have now, a system that we're working with. But they are able to receive so many things that they wouldn't have received outside of probation.
And just off the top of your head, if you know, how many kids do you see that face some of those extra challenges like autism or ADHD?
I can think off the top of my head, I've had at least 15, at least. No, actually more than that, because I can also order a psychological. We kind of dive into what's going on with these kids. Also, I can order a fitness to proceed, whether or not they're legally capable of understanding this process. And recently, I've seen more kids that are unfit than before.
And so do you think that that's more of an outside world issue? People need to pay more attention to what's actually going on before these kinds of things happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm a big advocate of being vigilant. If you have a niece, nephew, son, daughter that you see something's just not right, reach out to somebody and get help and let's talk. Let's figure this thing out together before you have to end up in juvenile.